Hi, I'm Geeta Srimati from The Hindu. Today I'm joined by historian Ramachandra Guha, who will be talking to us about his latest book, Speaking with Nature, The Origins of Indian Environmentalism. The book is 10 profiles of early environment thinkers from Rabindranath Tagore to Irish planner Patrick Geddes and Meera Ben, Gandhi's close associate, and others, all of whom either worked in ecology or showed a deep influence of the love for nature on their work. So let's hear from the author himself. Hi sir, happy to have you here in Chennai.
Thank you.
So I want to start with the people in the book. These are 10 diverse thinkers. How did you choose this particular group, and what do you believe their varied beliefs and perspectives say about the complexity of environmentalism in India?
So, any work of history involves inclusion and deliberate or accidental exclusion. So, in the course of my research over the last few decades into the history of environmentalism in India, I stumbled upon these 10 individuals. Some well known for other things like Tagore and K.M. Munshi, who also figured in the book. Others whom I had known of early on because of my research on environmental questions. And they are extremely diverse. So there are 10 individuals. So each life is singular. It spans an entire century. Their work spans an entire century from the 1880s to the 1990s. In fact, Krishnan was writing, N. Krishnan, the naturalist, who's the last figure in this book, who's actually a resident of Chennai, where we are speaking. Writes to the 1990s. So it's more than a century of Indian history. They worked in different parts of India. And more importantly, they worked in different landscapes. So they wrote variously about the wild, the forest, the farm, the waters, the soil, and about the city. So, and most of them, with the exclusion possibly of Munshi and Krishnan, so 8 out of 10, combined a concern for environmental sustainability with a deep concern for social justice. That's why this book is called Speaking with Nature, not speaking for nature. You have in India wilderness lovers who want to protect the tiger, protect the rainforest, but have really little concern for the underprivileged members of their own species. And what these thinkers are articulating is what I call a social ecology. That to have a habitable planet, you must also have, you cannot have a deeply flawed, unequal social and political system. But at the same time, you have to understand that there are natural limits to how much you can grow, how much economic development and industrialization take place. But it's the diversity of their lives, their approaches. They were all also writers and thinkers. So unlike in some of my other work, which is much more strongly biographical in nature, where I focus on an individual who has said, who's interesting. I focus much more on their own journey, their anxieties, their troubles, their friendships, their enmities, their romances, maybe their incarcerations, and so on. Here, there's a brief biographical introduction to each one of these thinkers, so you can place them in context. But then the emphasis is on their work, on their writing and their thought. And finally, what I've tried to do is to challenge the dominant narrative of the history of environmentalism, which comes from America and Europe, and which is really speaking for nature. It's only about protecting the wild. It's not about, human society and inequalities of access to natural resources within human society. The terrible and visible fact that the burden of environmental degradation falls disproportionately to the poor. Whether it is air pollution in the cities of northern India, or the depletion of groundwater aquifers, or contamination of the soil. So my thinkers are, I think, very important because they connect us to a more recent Indian tradition, post the Chipko movement, which is strongly rooted in social justice, which I have elsewhere called the environmentalism of the poor. So in that sense, this is that's kind of what unites them. They're all thinkers, they're all writers, they're articulating what I call a social ecology, not a pure ecology. It's not just about. This is not to say that protecting endangered species is not important. It's not to say that rewilding areas is not important. Protecting the coastline is not important. But there's also the whole question of the asymmetry of power, economic, political, social power, when it comes to human relations with nature. And particularly with urbanization, industrialization, you have kind of the encroachment of the urban industrial sector on peasants and tribals who rapidly lose control of their own natural surroundings that provided them livelihood and sustenance for decades. So that's it. One last thing I'd say, and then we can come to your next question, is that this book argues that there's an environmentalism before climate change and beyond climate change. So these people are in the, writing from the late 19th century, but their ideas are relevant in the third decade of the 21st century, because even if climate change didn't exist, India would be what I call an environmental basket case. Okay. So that's where their ideas are also timely and perhaps timeless.
Through this book, you've provided an intellectual genealogy for contemporary environmentalism in India. But how do you think these ideas or historical perspectives of these 10 thinkers would have an influence in the current environmental movements?
So, Geeta, the job of a historian is to educate. It's not to prescribe. It's to educate, it's to illuminate the past. The past for its own sake, and possibly some connections the past may have for the present. But my job is not to advise or to prescribe or to guide my reader in a particular direction. Read my book and do this. Right. Read my book and tell your chief minister or your prime minister to do that. Right. Change this law, change this law. No. That is not the job of a historian. I provide you the ideas, the analysis, these perspectives, and then you, the reader, make of it what you will. And connect it to your own life, to the lives of your fellow human beings, to the life of your district, your state, your country, and take it forward from there. So I've always been clear that is the work of a historian, to educate and to illuminate, and not to draw lessons, and still less to advise. And it's interesting, and because these people come from diverse backgrounds, they have diverse interests, different readers will find, some readers will find Tagore more compelling than anyone else, others who work in the city will find the ideas of Patrick Geddes strikingly relevant, and so on and so forth. So I provided you this, this kind of rich tapestry of a kind of early history of environmentalism, which has been largely forgotten and obscure. And I've tried to connect it to the present in some way. And what use is made of it, even what misuse is made of it, is beyond me. As with any other work of history that I write.
So, while researching and writing the book, was there anything about a particular figure, anyone, that surprised you or changed your perspective on their contributions to environmentalism?
Because I've been working in this field for so long, and I started this project really in the late 80s, early 90s, then it got interrupted and I returned to it. So it's hard to say, probably Tagore, in that I kind of knew Tagore had a keen aesthetic appreciation of nature. Right. I knew that in his poems he wrote about trees. I knew about the letters he wrote from Eastern Bengal when he was traveling there on behalf of his father, looking after his estates. But that his environmentalism was not just merely aesthetic. It was educational, it was political, it was prophetic. That was a revelation to me, because the others, early in my research I discovered Kumarappa and Mukherjee and Patrick Geddes and Veria Arvind. And Krishnan I had grown up reading, because The Statesman where he wrote came to my home in Dehradun. And Mirabai I knew because of my work in Gandhi and so on. So most of them, I was kind of aware that they are environmental pioneers and I need to probe deeper to flesh out in what precise ways that thought had an environmental stroke social component. But with Tagore, it was reading about him in other contexts that I stumbled upon these different dimensions. So possibly Tagore and maybe K.M. Munshi, who's also not really known for environmental interest, because he was a man of many parts. He was a novelist, he was a constitutionalist, he was a celebrated lawyer. He started the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. But briefly, he was trying to marry his Hindu faith with environmental concern, which I documented in this book. Yeah, so I suppose Tagore and K.M. Munshi were late inclusions in this book, but I think highly pertinent inclusions.
I want to talk a bit about the women in the book. Early on in the introductory chapter, you write that one limitation of the book is that there are only 2 women. But our earliest, most powerful environmental movement, Chipko, which you extensively studied,
Right.
was largely women-led.
Not largely, that's a misnomer. Women played an important role.
Right, right.
Considerable role.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
But
along with the men.
Yeah, it's also, indisputable that women did not have the access or space for formal education and things like that. So do you think 4-5 decades on, we still sort of place a higher value on traditional intellect rather than more than grassroots knowledge?
No, so I think in Chipko, men and women equally participated. Following Chipko, the most celebrated and iconic movement was the Narmada movement, in which the main leader was a woman, Medha Patkar.
Okay.
Alongside, you had the struggles of fisherfolk in Kerala, which also had a strong environmental component. And there too, women played a quite active role. And not just as leaders and mobilizers, but also as interpreters. The Malayalam poet Subhata Kumari, who wrote about the discussion of the Kerala landscape and so on, around that time. If you look at an organization like the KSSP, the Kerala Sahitya Parishad, women have been quite important. So the period I'm writing about is the first half of the 20th century, when women are not that visible, not that active, where they are, in fact, the operations of patriarchy are even more stringent and rigid than they, later on, we still a largely patriarchal society, but some of those, some of the choke has loosened, you might say, right? Now, so in this book, it's inevitable that there are few women. There are also few people, thinkers from disadvantaged backgrounds. So, Kumarappa is writing about caste inequality, and he may have been an OBC himself, but he was certainly not absolutely underprivileged. Elvin is writing about Adivasis, but he's not an Adivasi himself. Now, one of my hopes for this book, and I've said this elsewhere too, is that this is as I said earlier on, this is a history of environmentalism before climate change, indeed an environmentalism before Chipko. And there's a book to be written, talking about grassroots struggles. There's a really good book to be written by hopefully a younger scholar, not me, on Chipko and after, Indian environmentalism, Chipko and after. 1973 till 2023, 50 years, which would include grassroots movements. It would include like Chipko, Narmada, etc. It would include civil society activism to revegetate landscapes, water sources, medicinal plants, traditional varieties of crops, etc. It would include thinkers, scientists, social scientists, journalists, institutions. I can name them, but you kind of know what I'm getting at. So, tracing a history of Indian environmentalism, which would be much more diverse than in its social composition than this book. Because at the time these thinkers were operating, there was no social movement called environmentalism. These people were anticipating that. They were thinkers and writers. They were not activists. Though Mirabai and Kumarappa worked with Gandhi, they were really thinkers and writers. From 1973 onwards, you have a kind of a close, interpenetration of thinking and activism. And in that, there's a much deeper social base of people participating. To be, Tagore came from a very prosperous family. The others were also upper middle class or middle class, educated in universities. But the grassroots environmentalism that has so enriched Indian social and cultural and public life since Chipko has been much more diverse in its social composition. And I hope that this book, which does not deal with that side of it, challenges someone to write a complementary work of that kind.
That's actually a really nice idea. And also, I think right now there's a lot of strong grassroots movements coming up with various infrastructure projects.
That's right. And also mining, against mining in Chhattisgarh and so on. Absolutely. Yeah.
Slightly related to this last point is my next question. Given the focus of the government at the center, which has been in power for the last decade, on industrial and infrastructural development, what would you say are sort of, the challenges facing environmentalism in India?
So the challenges are huge. I would say it is not just this government. Every party, every government in recent Indian history has been deeply hostile to environmental sustainability, including the concerns of social justice that are connected with environmental sustainability. So it is, this may, the Modi regime may be the most anti-environmental government India has ever had. But Manmohan Singh's government was almost as bad. And if you look at the Western Ghats And if you look at the Gadgil report and its flouting and the animosity to the Gadgil report all across the Western Ghats, those who oppose the Gadgil report include the CPM in Kerala, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, the Congress in Karnataka, the BJP in Goa and Maharashtra and Gujarat and so on. So it cuts across because the deep interconnections between the contractor lobby, the builder lobby, the infrastructure lobby, the mining lobby and our political class across parties is what environmentalists, grassroots struggles, are pointing their finger at. So this is something which is an enormous hurdle and a burden, but we must go at it. I think it is deeply unfair when environmentalists are characterized as anti-development. That is totally false. They are saying that we need a more caring, more inclusive, more responsible form of development that is mindful of natural constraints, that does not benefit the rich at the expense of the poor, and also thinks of generations beyond us. What kind of world we are leaving to our children, our grandchildren. And we have to keep at it. Maybe one of the arguments that I don't make in this book, but my esteemed colleague Professor Madhav Gadgil has made, is that political decentralization is will lead to a truly inclusive and sustainable development. And for example, in Kerala, Professor Gadgil has been active with groups that say we are not opposed to mining, but instead of giving a mining contract to a large, Gujarati or Maharashtrian or North Indian firm, the villagers will form a cooperative. They will mine, and some alternatives have been practiced and shown to be viable. Because if the villager, it is shall we say, in a hill, some iron is found, and the local village mines it, they will make sure it is done carefully so that their own cultivated fields and water sources are not affected. And the economic benefits will stay in the village. But under the current law, the government can take over that forest with the iron ore and hand it over to whichever company gives it the best kickback, or whoever gives it electoral bonds or whatever, right? So I think these are things that are hurdles, obstacles, barriers that grassroots environmental struggles face, but they'll have to cope. They'll have to tackle.
Lastly, I want to ask you, considering the challenges posed by climate change and rapid urbanization and all of that, do you think there is already a new wave of environmental thinkers is emerging?
It's too early to say, but I'll say this, that among the young, there is a far greater awareness of the climate crisis and also other forms of environmental degradation than there was in my generation.
Right.
Or possibly even, I went to school in the 1970s. Possibly even those who went to school in the 1980s and 1990s. Today, there's a much greater awareness among the young. Sometimes this, a greater awareness leads to despair. And like young people saying, we won't have children, what kind of world will you bring them into? But maybe this greater awareness can translate in a more creative, positive direction. And there are young writers who write extremely well and sensitively about what is happening along the coast, in the forests, what infrastructure projects are doing, what kind of dispossession is taking place, what kind of environmental destruction is taking place. And, it's a field that lay dormant for some time because environmentalists have been because the earlier generation of environmentalists, the leaders of Chipko and Narmada, had aged. 30 years of activism had made them tired, and then there was a gap in between where which was exploited by governments hostile to environmental concerns. And now there's a young generation again emerging, and young writers again, writing with insight and passion about the challenges we face. So I would say the situation is bleak but not hopeless when I think of India's environmental and social future.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you.